California, and the place where I lived for like 24 years, Arizona, are the two places that are just really key to this election. So I've been watching, quite a bit.
Yeah, that's right. Arizona is about to be defined, but maybe it will take until tomorrow or a couple more days. It depends on the recount.
Yeah, and there'll probably be more counting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's see what happens. Yeah. Also in Mexico, we are very attentive to the outcome of the election because of the very strong relation between the United States and our country.
Yeah.
What happens there, it has a very important impact on Mexico.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yes. Yes. We can turn off our cameras when Glenda begins. I don't know if this is the next step, no? We need to turn off our camera. Is it correct, Emilio? Para que quede solamente Glenda en pantalla. Apagamos nuestras cámaras, ¿no?
Well, that might be, well, actually I didn't think of that, but yeah, we can do that, of course. Yeah, so that.
Do the participants have cameras on, or are they cameras off as well?
Okay.
I guess los participantes tienen las cámaras prendidas, ¿Lourdes, o no? Porque depende de...
Digo, nosotros como panelistas,
Lo que pasa es que de todas formas en Zoom no distingue realmente entre panelistas. O sea, si los participantes tienen la cámara encendida, van a aparecer de todas formas sus imágenes. O sea, no hay diferencia si nosotros prendemos o apagamos la cámara. Es a lo que me refiero.
Ok, pero para que los espectadores vean solo a Glenda.
Es que de todas formas, si los participantes pueden tener la cámara encendida, van a aparecer participantes con Glenda. O sea, no van a ver solo a Glenda.
Ok.
Podemos apagar la cámara, pero va a depender de si los participantes pueden encender la cámara. Tengo entendido que sí, pero ¿qué lo revisamos?
Sí. No, nada más para que quedara Glenda al centro.
No, claro.
Pero si no, lo que podemos hacer es pedir a Marco que ponga vista del hablante y como sea Glenda va a usar su PowerPoint.
Y Lulu, automáticamente esta sesión, cuando habla cualquier persona, se enfoca a esa persona.
Ah, buenísimo.
Pero la cámara, o sea, los participantes pueden tener su cámara prendida.
Sí, los participantes sí.
Ok.
No importa.
Claro. Yeah. In fact, I think it's good for Glenda to have the possibility of viewing some of the participants, to some of the reactions. It's always a little more pedagogical to view the participants' faces.
That's true. Yeah, I do look, so.
Sí. Sí, para los que nos escuchan, yo hablaba de los panelistas, los que estamos, las 6 personas que estamos aquí, que quedará solo activa la cámara de Glenda. Pero bueno, ya quedó claro que cuando uno habla, toma foco.
Así es.
Pues, bueno, queda un par de minutos. We have 2 more minutes.
Yeah, it seems that we are basically ready. Marco nos va a decir cuándo comenzar, ¿verdad, Lourdes?
Pues, damos un minuto más para ver si, no sé, que la gente se vaya conectando. Un par de minutos más.
Tenemos 50 espectadores.
Ok, damos un par de minutos más para que la gente se empiece a conectar.
Bien.
¿Cuántos estamos, Marco, ahorita?
One question, actually, will the translator be able to translate for me when we get to question and answers, if they write in Spanish?
I'll do that, Glenda. I'll do that for you. I'll translate the questions for you.
Wonderful. Okay, wonderful.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure, you're welcome.
I'm thinking I have about an hour and 15 minutes, maybe a little bit more of presentation that's broken up into different little pieces where I'll send them off to Padlets for a while to do an activity. We'll come back and talk about it. And then I'm estimating we'll have about a half hour for questions if there are any by the end of the 2 hour time. So
yeah, that's a great timing. I think perfect timing.
We'll see how it goes. It's never exactly as you plan, but
yeah, that's how it's usually.
That's what makes it fun.
It's part of the fun.
I was doing a presentation one day, and now that I'm home and I have this little grandson in California who takes the liberty of FaceTiming me now that he's home and his dad is home, right? And so I was doing a presentation and all of a sudden his little face popped up on my iPad right beside me. And I reached down to like turn it off, because I couldn't talk, and I hit the wrong button. And so there he was, like grinning at me until I fumbled around and turned it off. And later I called it back and he goes, "Oh, I saw you talking, Grandma." He goes, "I thought you were just talking to Grandpa." But I said, no, I was talking to a lot of other people.
It was an important difference.
There's so many cute stories about children and FaceTime now.
Yeah, we are accumulating many of those. Yeah, sí, Lourdes.
Podemos empezar si quieres.
Okay.
Nada más, antes de iniciar, vamos a grabar la sesión. Entonces, para poder empezar a grabar, si no hay ningún problema, pues iniciamos a grabar.
Okay, we are going to start recording the session, if you don't mind. And we are about to start.
Nada más la instrucción del inglés y del idioma. Si quieres la doy, Emilio, y te dejo el micrófono.
Ok.
Para todos nuestros participantes, los que se están conectando, en su pantalla tienen en el menú de la parte de abajo, hasta el extremo derecho, hay un botón con un pequeño mundo que dice interpretación. Para quienes deseen escuchar la conferencia con traducción, escogen el canal de español, y quienes deseen escuchar en vivo a Glenda, el canal en inglés. Entonces, esa es la opción de traducción. Muy bien, pues estamos listos.
Okay, so we start. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this first conference in our Universidad Iberoamericana cycle of conferences and workshops called Close Teaching in the Distance, Docencia Cercana en la Distancia. We created this cycle for strengthening our teaching practice in the distance learning context that we are living today. And this cycle of conferences and workshops are organized by the Teaching Development and Innovation Program in the Dirección de Desarrollo y Acompañamiento Educativo, DIDAE, of our university. My name is Emilio Corral, and I will be the moderator of this conference. Lourdes Caudillo is also participating as part of the moderation team. And today we are very glad to welcome Dr. Glenda Stump from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She will be offering her conference, Strengthening Instructional Design and Teacher-Student Interaction in Distant Learning. I'm going to read Dr. Stump's biographical information. Dr. Glenda Stump is an educator and education researcher whose career has spanned multiple disciplines. She currently works as an education research scientist in the Abdul Latif Jamil World Education Lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In this role, she engaged in local and international projects that include technology-enhanced STEAM education and teacher-faculty professional development, as well as projects related to development of the future workplace. Dr. Stump's research has focused on teacher and faculty professional development related to technology-enhanced or blended learning and human skills needed for the workforce of the future. Her work has included investigating relationships between students' motivational beliefs, learning strategies, higher order thinking and achievement, instructional design, developing instruments to measure students' cognition and motivation beliefs, examining the impact of teacher and faculty development programs, examining the process of scaling educational innovations in under-resourced areas, and investigating human skills needed for future workplace success. As an educator, Dr. Stump has been involved in developing teacher and faculty development programs at local and international levels, developing curriculum for education about human skills needed for the workplace, and she has given numerous presentations on the importance of active learning pedagogy as a means to improve student learning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stump in a virtual clap. Please, Glenda, go ahead. We are looking to learn from your conference.
Oh, thank you very much, Emilio. I am joined tonight by Julia Reynolds-Cuellar, also from MIT, who is the Associate Director of the JWell Higher Ed Collaborative. So I have the pleasure of working with her on a daily basis, and she was so kind as to join us tonight. So you see her waving there in the distance. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you all see that? Wonderful. Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. So it is indeed, as I said, a pleasure to be with you tonight. In the next hour or so, we will talk about active learning and some activities and a framework to help us design active learning or integrate active learning into our classes. Whether in person or remotely, we can use some techniques and some strategies to keep our students engaged in their learning. I always begin my sessions by telling my audience, whether students or faculty, what I expect them to get out of the session. So for you today, I have 3 outcomes. By the end of this session, I hope that you are able to identify the intended mode of engagement, of student engagement in active learning activities. And you'll understand a little better what this means as we go. You'll be able to use the ICAP framework to plan learning activities, and you'll be able to think about discussing the use of active learning pedagogy with your students. So my outcomes talk about the mode of engagement, but let's start by thinking just about the term engagement. I'd first like you to think about how you've tried to engage your students in your classes, both in person before the pandemic and now that many or most of you are online. So take a minute to think about that and then write what you've tried in chat. You can either write it to me privately or so that everybody can read it. So again, take a minute to think about ways that you've tried to engage your students in your teaching and share that. I see questioning, and I see stimulating debate, all right. Involving them in deeper understanding. We're going to talk more about that and kind of unpack that in a little bit. Anything else you can think of? What have you tried to engage your students? Involving them in group discussions, okay. Yeah. Okay, someone says asking how they feel. Yeah, actually getting your finger on the pulse, right, of how they feel, absolutely. The comment from Maria, can somebody tell me, I see motivate there. Motivate by, what does that say?
Making the class motivating and defying.
Okay, great. Yeah, by defining what's going to happen and trying to motivate them that way. Great. Oh, storytelling applied to the contents. Yeah, we love stories, right? Everybody loves stories. Okay. Yeah, those are great. I think somebody else says interesting topic according to their interest. So yeah, trying to figure out what they're interested in and using stories and examples based on that. Yeah, absolutely. So engagement to many just means that students are interested or paying attention, right? To educators, it's a little bit more nuanced, meaning that there are different ways we can engage our students. We can engage them behaviorally, by making sure that they're doing things. We can engage them emotionally, like some of you mentioned, getting their interest and getting them motivated to learn. And most of all, we want to engage them cognitively, right? We want them to think about what it is, that we're trying to get them to learn. There's been some recent work done on student engagement in general. There was a study that looked at comments from over 4,000 students that were enrolled of 10 of the most highly evaluated MOOCs, the massive open online courses. These students were asked what aspects of the MOOC kept them engaged or interested and coming back week after week. So there were some very, very frequently mentioned factors, and these were things like the course contained problem-centric learning. It focused on meaning making with real-world examples. It focused on active learning. Okay, the students were doing something, and that what they were doing was supported by feedback. So the activities required students to think about applying the content learned rather than just regurgitating the information. And then they said that course resources allowed for diverse learning needs or preferences. So they contained things like chunked video sequences with in-video quizzes or optional challenges for those who were more advanced, and additional outside resources for extra practice or help. They named instructor attributes as something that kept them engaged. So enthusiasm and humor, these things are important and also contagious to the students, right? They talked about the importance of peer interaction. So organized time for students to exchange ideas. In synchronous sessions, this could be in breakout rooms. In asynchronous sessions, this could be on discussion forums or even using annotation tools, which we'll talk about in a little while. And then lastly, they talked about instructor accessibility. So the instructors provided a regular time to answer questions. So some of these factors you can see are provided strictly by the course itself, the materials that are problem focused and that there are extra resources. But other of these factors that keep students engaged are provided by the way we structure our courses. So as you undoubtedly noticed, active learning was cited as being positive by students in the study I just mentioned. So when we design activities for a session, it's also important to think about exactly how engaged or how active we want our students to be. So when we think about a working definition of active learning, there was a faculty member from the Western United States. His name was Scott Freeman, and his colleagues collected written definitions of active learning from over 300 people who attended biology lectures at universities across the United States and Canada. They took all those written definitions that people submitted and they coded them, looked for themes and what people thought active learning was. And then they developed this definition, which they then used in their work as the kind of the standard for active learning. So their work resulted in the definition that you see on this slide. Active learning engages students in the process of learning through activities and/or discussions in class, as opposed to just passively listening to an expert. And it also emphasizes higher order thinking and often involves group work. An important question that we ask often is how much active learning is enough, or when should we actually be using this? So neuroscientists have found that our attention span is approximately 10 to 15 minutes, and there are some differences of opinion on that, but that's an average. And then we lose concentration. So it's recommended that we break up intense learning sessions every 10 to 15 minutes with some type of activity that students are actively engaged in, or where they're actively engaged with the material that you want them to learn. Things like concept questions are one of those activities, and we'll talk about some more later. In the diagram that you see on the slide, you see that the class could begin with some type of introduction. So I typically use this time to get students thinking about maybe what they learned in the last class, or what they might know about the material to be covered in today's class, sort of get an idea of how much they know and don't know. And then, as suggested in this diagram, do about 10 to 15 minutes of content delivery, break that up with an activity, then do a little bit more content delivery, do another activity until the end of the class, then where you wrap up or summarize what they should have learned. So these little activity breaks allow students to kind of rest their brain, allow them to reset, and hopefully you can then engage them in some kind of an active activity that would help them learn the material better. I want to share a story with you to reinforce this point. This is a finding from a study that supports the idea that refocusing attention might be needed during long classes. The slide shows some results from a study that was done right here at MIT. I have to tell you that the purpose of the study was not to study learning, however. It was to test a device that could non-invasively measure students' electrodermal activity, or activity on the skin surface. So electrodermal activity is stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system, and it's been shown to be reflective of emotion, cognition, and attention. So it's widely recognized that attention-grabbing stimuli and attention-demanding tasks also provide increased electrodermal responses, right? So again, it was not part of the study as designed, but this data is from one student who chose to wear this sensor for 24 hours a day for 7 days. So if you look at the diagram, I'm going to grab my cursor here. Whoops. Yeah, if you look at the diagram and start at the bottom, you can see that on day one, this student had some spikes or increased activity during lab, during the homework, a little bit during sleep, and then you get to class here the next day, and there's hardly any spikes, right? On day two, you see kind of the same pattern. So there's some spikes during lab, little during homework, a lot during sleep, and none during class. Day three, there doesn't seem to be any class. There's some lab, so you see some little spikes. Day four, some spikes during study, none during class. Day five, again, same thing. Spikes during study, none during class. Day six, they had an exam. So you can see there's a lot of spikes here. So studying, taking the exam, and then off to class, so a little bit. And then day seven, there wasn't any. So again, The intent of this study was not really to point out students' activity in class. It was to study the device itself. And as a researcher, I readily acknowledge that this is a sample of one, right? But as an educator, you have to wonder, like, what happened to that student during class, right? Was this a case where they just really were not cognitively engaged, right? And so it makes you think about how we can remedy that situation. We also, though, have more credible evidence from research with a larger sample size that active learning is beneficial to students. So the same researcher who developed that working definition of active learning that I showed you earlier also published some work showing the effect of active learning on students. They did a meta-analysis, so looking at 225 research studies in which the faculty member used some type of active learning. And it was anything from asking clicker questions to group work to just anything other than lecture. So on average, they found that if any type of active learning was used, students' exam scores improved by 6%, and that was over students who attended just lecture courses. And again, when they compared traditional lecture courses with those that included active learning, on average, the students in the traditional lecture courses were 1.5 times more likely to fail than in courses that utilized active learning. So in addition, I don't have results on this slide, but this same author, along with some other researchers, showed that using active learning steadily during a class helped to close the gap between students who routinely performed well in classes and then others who were destined to fail. In this university, they had a profile of students that had come from backgrounds where maybe they didn't have great high school preparation classes, or maybe they were the first in their family to go to college and so didn't have a lot of support. And so they had a profile of students who they knew didn't tend to do as well during classes. But yet when they used active learning activities, they found that closed the gap. These students started to do much better and soon were closer to the students who tended to always do well. So I think this is an important finding in light of the many diverse populations that we serve in universities today, something to think about. So if we're convinced that active learning is a good thing, and I hope by now you are, the next important question is what kind of active learning, and is all active learning the same? So work in this area has shown us that some types of active learning activities lead to deeper learning than others. The ICAP framework that you see on the slide, and that was developed by a mentor and a colleague of mine, Dr. Micheline Chi, who's now at Arizona State University. The ICAP framework classifies activities according to what students are doing overtly. So what we see students doing is how we classify activities. And this gives us an idea of what they're doing cognitively. So what kinds of cognitive processes they're engaged in. And it's, I think, an amazing story as to how she developed this framework. It was in the early 2000s when there was a lot of talk about how active learning just wasn't a good idea, right? People said, well, look at the research. Some research says it works, some research says it doesn't. And there was a lot of arguing among scholars about whether active learning was really worth the effort it took to create it. And so what Dr. Chi did was took a lot of the literature that talked about active learning and looked at what they really did, what they were asking students to do, and was able to categorize it in terms of that, like what students were doing overtly, how they enacted that, how they actually did it, and then what the learning outcomes were, and organize this framework. So as you design activities for classes, it's important to think about that, how engaged you expect your students to be. So according to the ICAP framework, as I said, the type and the amount or extent of overt engagement, so what we see them doing, can be an indicator of or a window into what they're thinking or their cognitive processes. So an easy way to think about this is kind of by asking yourself or thinking about these questions. So what are you asking students to do? Are you asking them to sit quietly and listen? Are you asking them to manipulate the material in some way? So if they're reading it, underline it. If you've given them formulas to solve math problems, are they just plugging numbers into formulas? Are they following lab instructions rotely, just sort of reading it, doing it, reading it, doing it? Are they remembering a law or a rule? Are they searching for a definition to match a concept? So manipulating that material in some way. Or are they making an inference, right? Or constructing a product that goes beyond the information that you've given them? Or lastly, are they interacting with someone else to make those inferences or construct products jointly that go beyond the information that you give them? As you see, each of these questions denotes an increased amount of engagement or sort of thinking about the learning material. So here's a visual representation of the ICAP framework. And the framework suggests that student engagement can be thought of hierarchically. And the modes of engagement are what we see students overtly or visibly doing. And this gives us an indication of what they're doing cognitively. Each of these modes has potential to result in different depth of learning. In the research that I and some other colleagues have conducted with Dr. Chi, we've shown that when students are engaged more deeply, and this would be in the modes that you see in the upper left, constructively or interactively, they do indeed learn better. The name ICAP comes from the modes of engagement. So it's interactive, constructive, active, and passive. So if we start at the lower right of the slide, lower right-hand corner, we see that the passive mode involves simply listening, right? The active mode of engagement involves manipulating the learning material in some way. The constructive mode involves generating an understanding. And the interactive mode involves generating that understanding together or dialoguing with someone else. And we'll talk about these in a little more depth in the next several slides. So when we talk about activities that produce or elicit these modes of engagement, we refer to them as passive, active, constructive, or interactive tasks or activities. And so thinking about them in this way helps us to plan activities that not only fit into our lesson. So if you've been doing activities previously and now you think about it in terms of ICAP, thinking, okay, what was I asking them to do? You can actually alter that a little bit to make it more engaging, to sort of get them to engage more deeply. Oftentimes, and when we first started to think about active learning, we just had lists, right? People said, here's a list of activities and do these, and this is active learning. But really, from the list, if we tried those things and they didn't work, we had no reason to understand. We had no understanding of why they didn't work, right? But if you think about this in terms of ICAP, you can say, okay, what were they doing? Were they just reading something? Were they manipulating the information? Was I asking them to make inferences or think more deeply about it? And so then you can understand, why things may or may not be effective. It's important to remember that these are modes of engagement or ways that students interact with the learning materials, not types of learning per se. So interactive, constructive, and active modes of engagement all describe active learning. They're all active, right? But they describe the ways that students engage with the material. The framework gives us some ideas about what kinds of activities might be better than others. It's also important to know that the same material can be implemented at different levels of engagement, depending on what you ask your students to do and how they actually do it. So for example, if I ask you to read a paragraph about the coronavirus in Europe, you would probably engage in a passive mode of engagement. So you just read it, okay, and you'd be putting information in your short-term memory. If I ask you to tell me what the current incidence of the virus is in Germany, you would probably look at the passage again, you'd search for that information, you might highlight it, and that would be an active mode of engagement, right? So you're focusing on something and paying more attention to it. But then if I ask you to summarize that paragraph in your own words, or describe, the change in your understanding of the virus in the past 8 months, you would be generating. You would be thinking about, okay, how did we understand the virus 8 months ago? What do we understand now? And what's the difference, right? So you're going beyond the information that's in that paragraph. You're using that. You're cognitively wrestling with it, right? To come up with a different understanding. And then if I ask you to explain that current understanding to someone that you were speaking with, to the person beside you, and they started to ask you questions and say, well, that's not the way I understand it, or wait, you're not remembering that correctly. And you discuss that and you have a back and forth conversation about it and come to a general consensus, that would be an interactive mode of engagement. So you're co-constructing an understanding of the information. So you see, each of those modes has potential to result in a different kind of understanding, from fairly superficial to a deeper meaning. And it was all using a paragraph, right, about the coronavirus. So what is the caveat in this? So what could go wrong with this? It's always what we should ask ourselves, right? Well, the caveat is that students do not always do what we plan for them to do, right? So when I plan lessons, I always have this beautiful vision of how it will go. I'll say this, I'll ask them to do this, they'll go through this thinking process, and voila, they'll learn what I ask them, what I want them to learn. But not always so. Students oftentimes think of ways to sort of get around what we ask them to do. So it's important always to monitor, how students engage in the activities that we've planned for them. Again, you would ask the same 4 questions. So what are they actually doing? Are they just sitting and listening? Are they manipulating the information in some way? Are they going beyond the information that I've given them? And are they actually truly collaborating in a back and forth manner to produce a new understanding? So if we monitor students' engagement in the activity as it's happening, we can sometimes redirect them to a deeper level of engagement. Okay, so let's dig a little bit deeper into the framework and talk about some of the examples that would relate to it. So in the passive mode, the learner is just paying attention, right? So they're receiving information, by listening to a video or even reading. Cognitively, this mode of engagement helps them to store information, but doesn't really help them to embed it in a relative schema or mental model. So this information often tends to be isolated if they're just passively listening. I used to call this fun facts to know, right? You might remember a lot or know a lot of things or remember a lot of things, but they're not necessarily connected to a mental model or an idea of how something works. In terms of outcomes, when students engage passively, they typically can recall that knowledge verbatim in identical contexts. So if I read that, the coronavirus reached 100 cases a day in a particular town, I can regurgitate that fact, right? Sometimes we call that inert knowledge. In the active mode of engagement, learners are manipulating the information, as I said earlier. They're focusing on it, they're selecting it, they're underlining it, highlighting it, copying it, taking verbatim notes. If you're talking in a class and they're writing down everything you say, that's an active mode of engagement. As I had mentioned earlier, if they're following a lab procedure, plugging numbers into a given formula. If you've given them a worksheet to do as a learning method, an active mode can really just be searching for or repeating information that's been given, like looking it up in the textbook. Cognitively, they're integrating this new information with existing knowledge, right? The existing schema or ideas become a little more complete, they become strengthened. And in terms of outcomes, if students learn, if they engage actively in the information, they can typically apply that knowledge in similar contexts. Okay, it doesn't have to be identical, but they can apply it typically in similar contexts. So here's an example of an active activity that we developed and used in a project that I was involved in with some material science engineering students. These students were learning about unit cell directions. They were learning about how to draw and index them. So in this activity, as the instructor was introducing this information and these concepts, he was demonstrating on a cell drawn on a whiteboard. The students were listening to his explanation and literally copying his diagram onto their handout. So they were, when they were copying, this was exhibiting an active mode of engagement. So here's another example that I used in a workshop where I introduced the ICAP framework. So after I talked about each of the modes of engagement, I asked workshop participants to match the ICAP mode in the left-hand column to what we might see learners do in the right-hand column. So this was just really asking them to search their notes and find, you know, the matching definition with the behavior. So it's an active activity because we're really not asking them to think beyond the information they've given, right? They're just repeating it or searching for it, or in a sense, manipulating it. Okay, so now it's your turn. This is a check your understanding part. So if you would go to the link that Julia will post in chat, and Julia, if you'll post the link to the active questions, I'll ask you to answer those. This should take you to a Google form where you'll see 3 different questions, and we'll go through these one at a time. So the first one asks you, is this an active mode of engagement? So your students are watching a video about diffusion on their computers. And I'll give you a minute to respond. Okay, Julia, can you tell me what the breakdown is? How many yeses do we have?
Are your students watching a video about diffusion on their computers? We have no at 38, yes at 2, and 3 at I'm not sure.
Okay. So yeah, if you answered no, you're right. It's not active. So if they're just watching on their computers, that's more of a passive mode of engagement, right? But now you see that they're stopping the video, they're rewinding, and they're watching some parts again. So now, is this an active mode of engagement by the ICAP definition?
We have yes 42, no 5, and 6 I'm not sure.
Okay, so yeah, if you said yes, that would be a correct answer. Does anybody want to volunteer in chat why they think it might not be? Does anybody want to take a venture and put in chat why it might not be? Okay, good point. Somebody says maybe there's not manipulation of the information. So not directly, but actually stopping, rewinding, saying, wait, I want to see that part again, would be considered, you know, manipulation or focusing on that information. They're not physically touching it per se, but they're focusing and selecting, right? So yeah, so if they're doing that, then they are more actively engaged. Okay, so there's one more on this. So you just demonstrated how to do an algebra or calculus problem. Then students complete another problem using the same procedure. Is that an active mode of engagement?
We have yes 45, no 9, and 6, I'm not sure.
Okay, so if you said yes, that's a correct answer. Doing a math problem using just a given formula is active, right? So you're engaging with it, but you're not really thinking beyond the information given. However, if you gave them a really difficult problem where they had to reorganize the formula or even come up with their own formula, then that would be more of a constructive task, right? But just plugging information into a formula is more of a manipulative task. So not thinking beyond the information that they're given. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the constructive mode. The constructive mode of engagement, in that mode, the learner is generating information or producing output that goes beyond the ideas that are presented. So they're self-constructing an understanding by explaining or elaborating, justifying, providing reasons, reflecting, predicting outcomes, or even generating hypotheses. So cognitively, they're inferring new knowledge, really. They're inferring a new understanding, right? Existing knowledge that they have becomes more organized and more detailed. Their schema or mental models may become more linked with other related knowledge, so it's more integrated. In terms of cognitive outcomes, learners who engage in a constructive mode can then tend to transfer their knowledge. They can use that knowledge in novel contexts. And so, you know, if we're thinking about transfer, getting students to engage this way is more effective for that. So this is an example of a constructive activity. This is a worked example. It's a physics problem with, on the slide, you can see that the student's self-explanation is under each part. So in a worked example, where you're giving that to students to see alone, you might annotate, you know, or have the students explain why that problem solution is the way it is, right? Have them explain. So this worked example paired with self-explanation is also a valuable teaching strategy. And so you can see I've labeled the students' explanations as number 1, 2, and 3. So you can see in the first statement, which is labeled as number 1, the student identifies his confusion between the mass and the body, the mass W and the body, which is the not. So sometimes students misunderstand because there's a conflict between what they read in the materials and what they already thought, you know, was right. And so while self-explaining, this learner identifies this conflict and revises his idea of mass and body. And you can see that in statement number 2, where the learner says, oh, I see. So the W will be the force and not the body. Okay. And then finally, in statement number 3, the learner develops the correct understanding of what the body is and the problem. So good self-explanations either identify and correct misconceptions, or they help to elaborate on the ideas through inferences made. So in this example, the learner identified and corrected their own misunderstanding. There's been a lot of work done on self-explanation as a learning strategy and the effectiveness of it. And I think when we think about it initially, we think, well, how can students do that themselves, right? But here is an example where, you know, they sense that conflict in what they understood and what the information in the text or, you know, the worked example is giving them, and they reflect on it and actually do resolve their own internal conflict and revise their thinking. Here's another example of a constructive activity. Asking students to create a concept map is an example of a constructive task. So concept maps are graphical tools to organize and represent knowledge. So they require a constructive mode of engagement because creating it requires them to re-represent the material in a different way. So when we think about coding theory, we say that we process information in two channels. So we process it visually, spatially, and then auditory, verbally, right? So if students have heard information in a lecture, or if they read it and then they re-represent it, or they represent it in a visual spatial mode, it really helps them or asks them to put it all together and restate it in a different way, which improves their learning. So it appeals to both ways of learning, right? They have to organize the information and connect it, any new information, to prior knowledge or what they already know. In engineering, when solving mechanics problems, if you have them do free body diagrams, that's also a similar form of a constructive activity. The one that I have on the slide as an example, this was what a student had done after they heard a lecture on a function of the heart and what blood consists of and how it travels through the body. So there are free concept mapping programs that students can download. So it might be an activity that you could try with them. Okay, so now let's see if this is clear to you. So go to the link in the chat and answer the questions about constructive tasks. If Julia, if you'll please post that link. And same question, is this a constructive task or a constructive mode of engagement? So you describe the auto cycle to your students. You ask them to create a visual representation of the process. For those of you who aren't engineers or physics folks, the auto cycle is an idealized thermodynamic cycle that describes the functioning of a typical spark ignition piston engine. It's found in automobile engines. So what do you think? Is it a constructive task or is constructive, would it elicit a constructive mode of engagement? Okay, Julia, what do we have for answers?
Yes, 42, and no, 2, 1, I'm not sure.
Okay, so yeah, I think those of you who said yes would be correct. So we're having them represent information in a different way, right? So they've heard it, and now they have to organize it. They have to put it in a pictorial representation and organize it, which really does engage them constructively and also helps them understand it better. And if nothing else, you know, some of these activities like concept mapping help them understand that they don't know it, right? So if they listen to you, and sometimes the students do this, right? They nod their head and you think, oh, everybody's getting it, right? If they listen to you and then you have them do something like this, they suddenly realize, oh, no, I didn't get it, right? So it's actually a great self-assessment mechanism as well. I always think that, you know, not only do we have to get the information in to students, you know, if we're giving them information, but they have to be able to get it back out. So they have to process it and be able to articulate it and really acknowledge their understanding of it. So having them concept map is definitely a way to get that accomplished. Okay, so we said that they created a visual representation of the process, but then you see several students copying a diagram of the auto cycle from Wikipedia. Is this a constructive mode of engagement?
No, 40, 6, yes, and 5, I'm not sure.
Yeah, the no's have it this time. No, that becomes active, okay? So they are still engaged, right? They're doing it, but they're copying, right? They're focusing on that picture and they're copying it. So it got demoted, so to speak. It became an active activity as opposed to one that would be more beneficial as a constructive mode. Okay, and the last one is Before you demonstrate a chemical reaction, you ask students to write down what they think will happen and why. So is this a constructive task, or should it make your students engage in the material in a constructive mode?
We almost have a full consensus on this one. Yes, 53, and 1, I'm not sure.
Okay, so yeah, you're right. Prediction is definitely asking them to go beyond the information that they were given, right? Asking them to predict and provide their reasoning is a constructive activity. One caveat to that, I will say, though, if you did a little bit of a lecture portion beforehand and you said, now when I do this chemical reaction, here's what's going to happen, right? And then you'd go to the reaction and you ask them to predict, they're really going to search their notes and recall what you told them, right? So that becomes more of an active activity. So if they have that information already and they're asked to focus on it, select it, recall it, it's active. If you're asking them to go beyond what they're given, then it becomes a constructive activity. And I will add here, we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but asking them to write it down, as I had said in this example, stimulates all students to seriously consider that question instead of just the one student that raises their hand, right? So if you're demonstrating this chemical reaction over Zoom, like doing some kind of a demonstration, online, how might you capture their prediction? Like, how might you know what they're thinking? What ideas do you have? And what ideas do you currently use? I'll bet some of you already have done these kinds of things. If you want to understand what everybody's thinking, as opposed to just that one student that raises their hand. Yep, you can do a survey, absolutely. Collective sharing, yeah, absolutely. You can have them share in chat too, right? You can say, okay, share in chat. If you really want them not to copy off of somebody else, you can say share privately in chat with me, right? You can say, put that in chat. I want to see what your prediction is. You can use a Google form like we're using here. So put a link in chat and say, go here and tell me what you predict and why. And this is good if you want to do some formative assessment, right? So if you really want to understand how your students are thinking, having them write it in a Google form where you can go back and collect that information later is also helpful. You can have them respond on some of the phone programs. I don't know if you have used things like Socrative or Kahoot. Are these things that people use at your university? Emilio, I'm looking, I can see you. Can you nod? Do people use Kahoot or Socrative? Or, yeah, Lourdes says yes, yeah. So that's a quick, easy way to get them to respond.
Very often.
Great, okay. Okay. All right, so last one, interactive mode. I had said earlier that it's actually productive dialogue between two people. So learners co-construct or co-infer knowledge by building on the other person's ideas, right? They can respond to feedback, they can defend an idea or challenge somebody else's idea. But to benefit from this mode, however, the activity has to be a constructive activity, right? It has to challenge them to go beyond the information that they're given, right? And this is, I think this mode is rather hard to achieve because it truly does take a back and forth between learners, right? And they have to be building on the other person's information. So if I said to Lourdes, Lourdes, I think the world is flat. And Lourdes said, okay, and nodded her head. That's not co-construction. Like, we were together and we were talking, but that's not co-construction. But if she said to me, Glenda, that is not what I think. And why in the world do you think that? And I came back with, well, I read this on Facebook. When I look out the window, all I see is a horizontal surface, and I give her my reasoning, and she comes back and challenges that and tells me what her reasoning is. And we have that true back and forth conversation and come to some common agreement. That's co-construction, right? And so that's what this particular mode of engagement is. And I think that is, as faculty and teachers, if we're wanting students to engage this way, it does take some facilitation. It takes some, looking over their shoulder, if you will, and seeing how they interact. When we use this cognitively, learners can create new knowledge from these joint creating processes. When we add someone else's understanding or ideas into our own, we then are able to gain new knowledge and perspectives. And this is how, inventions, products, procedures, and ideas come about. Oftentimes it's this true interactive mode of engagement. So pretty interesting to think about. So here's an example of a multi-step activity that we used in that same material science class that I talked about earlier. This was about changes in unit cells during disasters, like the sinking of the Titanic and the destruction of the World Trade Center and several others. So this activity contained several types of tasks. Initially, students were only matching historical occurrences with possible reasons for property changes and unit cell transformations of materials. So they were literally just selecting an answer, right? Matching and selecting. But then, and that's an active task. But then they were seated in groups, and they had to explain to the group why they chose their answer, right? So that rationale, that justification then makes it a constructive task. But then as a group, they had to come to a common understanding and complete one worksheet, which they turned in for a grade on that assignment. So they really had to work collaboratively and talk back and forth about, who was right and why it was right, so that, they could submit that for their worksheet. So this was a constructive activity done with partners then, which makes it interactive. In this particular instance, we had a table leader for the group who made sure that everybody did respond, provide an answer and a rationale for their choice. We were concerned, this was a study, and we were concerned that there would be unequal group participation. So we tried to ensure that by selecting a leader for each group and making sure that happened. We even gave them kind of a little cheat sheet or a protocol that said, give everybody 2 minutes to, do their matching, and then, go around the table and ask. We gave them prompts, say, ask these types of questions. A great way to get students to engage in the interactive mode is by asking them to collaboratively annotate a reading. And this is something that works well in a digital environment as well. You can use a software program like Perusal, where you post a paper, and then students, as they read it, can make comments or ask questions on it. And they do that in the margins of the paper. It's just like, when you would write notes to yourself when you're reading a book or a hard copy paper. But other students actually see that same document, and they can either explain, what somebody else had a question about, or they can build on the question, and make it a deeper question. And so you can have a great discussion using some of these types of tools. And you, as a faculty member, also can be looking at the discussion that's happening and understand where students might need some extra work in class as well, in the in-person setting or in the synchronous settings. I don't know if Perusal is something that you've heard of. I have the link to it in my notes, which you'll get after this presentation. So if you're interested in it, it is an open source or free software for people that are interested in it, as long as you're not using copyrighted materials, I think is how they phrase it. Okay, so we have one more list of questions. Julia, if you'll post the questions for the interactive mode of engagement, I'll ask the same type question. Is this an interactive task or mode of engagement? So you assign students a difficult physics problem and tell them to work in pairs to solve it. Interactive, yes, no, or I'm not sure. Julia, what do we have for responses for this one?
We have yes 28, no 1, I'm not sure 1.
Okay, yeah. If you said yes, it's interactive, I agree. We could maybe argue that a bit, but I think predominantly it's interactive. It's planned that way because a difficult problem is probably one where they have to do some reasoning and some higher level thinking. It's not the same as just having a formula that you would plug, numbers into. So it is a constructive task that you are asking students to do with someone else. They have to figure out how to solve it. So it has the potential to be interactive, right? Okay, but now you see that as the students are working, you see one student who's dominating the conversation in each of the groups. Is that an interactive mode of engagement?
We have no 34, I'm not sure 10, yes 5.
Okay, if you said no, you're correct. So asking students to figure out how to solve a problem is interactive if both contribute. So if they're building on each other's knowledge, right? But if one person dominates that conversation, that's not co-construction. This is a situation in which monitoring what's happening could help students engage in the way you hoped they would. If you're in a Zoom class and you put students in breakout rooms to solve these problems, you can move from one room to the other to sort of get an idea of what's happening. It's not quite the same as being in the same classroom where you can look at every group at the same time and see that there's that back and forth, but it's a reasonable substitute for that. And I typically will ask them, did you both contribute, right? Do you feel that you both understand how this goes? And can you both solve the problem? Okay, and the last one is you ask students to write an exam question, administer it to a peer and discuss the answer with that peer, and confirm that the peer understands the correct answer. What do you think? Is that an interactive task or not?
We have yes 47, no 3, I'm not sure 2.
Okay, yeah, I think if you said yes, I think you're correct, right? I think this is set up as an interactive task. We know, you all know, that writing the exam question is an excellent constructive activity. That's one of the hardest activities, I think. Discussing the answer with a peer should make it interactive if there's some back and forth, if there's asking questions or challenging an answer. So that's kind of an unknown in this situation. So those of you who said no or I'm not sure, have some reason to say that. It may not be truly interactive depending on how it goes. So the ICAP hypothesis says that interactive engagement produces better learning than constructive, constructive better than active, and active better than passive. That's kind of the hierarchical nature that I talked about earlier. We did see in the work that's been done that constructive and interactive modes of engagement usually result in deeper and better learning than active and passive modes, right? So as you think about that, if you remember this diagram, I think it helps you think about structuring activities. So keywords are passive is listening, active is manipulation, constructing is generating, and interactive is generating together.
Glenda, there is a comment from our Vice Chancellor, Silvia Schmelkes. She says that someone was saying that the application of the ICAP framework depends on the subject. And she says that she believes constructive and interactive tasks are applicable to any subject. Could you comment on this?
Yeah, that is absolutely true. In some of the work that we did, we looked at math classes, we looked at science and biology classes, and we looked at language classes. And boy, there was a difference in the applicability of it. And I think some of the most difficult, and these were 8th and 9th graders, right? So younger than students you're dealing with, but language is a lot of recall, right? And remembering rules of grammar. So that one was difficult to get people to be truly constructive and interactive until they got to the point where they were, creating or doing speaking type tasks, right? Math also was a little more challenging because there's a lot of just application of formulas, right? And if you remember earlier, I said that a lot of that, we call it plug and chug. So plugging numbers into a formula is engaging, but more active engagement, unless you have to, rework a formula, create a new formula, figure out a way to, demonstrate how a formula works. It's easiest to think about, I think, in the science realm, science and engineering, definitely. Yeah, where there's a lot of conceptual knowledge. So I do agree. So another thing that I'm going to switch topics slightly is another thing to think about is what I call one versus many. So when we're planning these activities, we have to think about whether we're going to engage one person or whether we're going to be able to engage everybody, right? And there's always, when I hear people say, well, we're going to have a discussion, I always think about the discussions where that one student in the front row is really discussing, like really, really engaged, but all the students in the back of the room are kind of passively, listening. Some might be cognitively engaged, but many are not if they don't have anything to say. So I think it's always important to think about bringing everybody into that conversation and getting them to think about it. And we can't always make sure that they're, correct, but we can at least make sure that they're thinking about it, right? So I think planning activities in any context, we have to think about, getting everybody engaged. I think we have to think about it more in an online context because learners just have a greater opportunity to become distracted, when they're in their own environments and out of the view of the instructor. So I always think about planning activities that require all learners to be involved in responding in some manner. Otherwise they can sit passively, present, but without cognitively engaging in the material. And that does bring up one of the arguments when people hear about ICAP and when they see the definitions, right? When they see passive that says listening. And, they say, well, some people listen and really think about it, right? They're really mulling that material over and they're thinking, oh, that relates to what I learned before. And they're making those connections and they're integrating. And that's true, but we contend that it's not true for a huge percentage of the students. And it's not necessarily something that people can do for like a whole hour or 2-hour class period. And so while Dr. Chi doesn't debate the fact that happens, her theory says that, it's more reliable if we think about what we see them doing, that connection between physically doing something and cognitive engagement is more reliable. Okay, for the next few minutes, we're going to talk about some different types of activities and then the time that they take. When I talk to people about active learning, a lot of times they come into that thinking that active learning means projects or group work, but that's not necessarily so. And you saw earlier the diagram I showed, you could have a session where, you're using some lecture, but if you break it up into small segments and insert active learning activities into it, it can be very, very effective for your students' learning. So short activities include things like just simply posing a question, right? Thinking of good questions about what were just covered. It's always important to give students enough time to actually think about a question. So thinking about questions that you have requires you to first reflect on what you heard, decide if you understand it or not, and then actually formulate the question. So it takes a few minutes to do that, sometimes more than the 2 minutes that you see on the slide. But things that are a little bit longer, we call them medium length activities, are things like, asking students to recall prior material, right? These are called quick things. Like tell them, turn to the person beside you if you're in person, and tell them the most important thing you remember from the last class. Or if you're online, you can use the site called Padlets, which we're going to go to in a little bit, and have them just post it. Post 2 things you remember from the last class. Or last period we discussed, conductive heat transfer, or whatever your topic was. List as many principal features of this process as you can. You can give them those types of assignments to get them thinking about the material that you've covered. Concept questions, like we just did, where you ask a question that has multiple choice answer, is a quick way to engage them. Again, students can answer those without thinking too deeply about it. One of the better ways to get them to think deeply about it is to then have them move into a group and discuss the answer. That takes a little bit more time. And then lastly, another thing that has been shown to be effective in learning is called the pause procedure. And this is really, somebody did work on this in like 20 years ago, I think, or even longer. It simply allows students time to think about what they just heard or learned during a lecture time. So this person allowed students about every 15 minutes to stop for 2 or 3 minutes during the lecture time. During that time, they turn to their neighbor to discuss lecture content, right? They ask for clarification of concepts, or they caught up on their notes. And sometimes just having a few minutes break to actually, finish writing a thought in your notes is really, really helpful. So in the study where this was tested, there was no student-instructor interaction during those pauses. And they found that the students had better scores on free recall, which they asked them at the end of class what they remembered about class, right? They had better scores on free recall and also better scores on a end of the unit objective test. So that original work, as I said, is older. It was from some time ago, but there's a more recent study conducted with medical students, which actually showed the same result. So this author who used the procedure with medical students pointed out that this produced increased or better learning outcomes, and it took actually 6 to 7 minutes of class time. They would pause every 15 minutes and then allow students to ask each other questions. So I think it's an interesting concept. So with Zoom and breakout rooms, if you're gonna pause and allow them to ask each other questions, you would need to maybe randomly assign them to some breakout rooms in pairs or trios, right? So it would take an extra few minutes to get that accomplished during a class. But again, it shows that, students need that time to wrestle with the material, to talk about it and discuss it for a few minutes with each other. So more activities that we kind of call medium length are things like 1, 2, or 3 minute papers. And you can use this however you choose, but you can say, stop during class and say, okay, I want you to take out a piece of paper or open up a Word document on your computer, take 3 minutes and write. And you can say, I want you to compare and contrast 2 things that you just told them, maybe during the class, right? You can have them support or explain a statement that you made, right? Or you could have them summarize in their own words something that you just discussed. Any of those techniques are great just to get them to stop, pause, and think about what they're hearing, right? Get them to process that information a little bit more. I also use mud cards, and this I typically use at the end of a class, and it's a formative assessment technique that the word MUD is an acronym for most unclear discussion. And it's a way to have students reflect on their understanding of what they're learning. So I usually ask as the first question, what was the muddiest point for you? What's still unclear to you at the end of this class? And this is very similar to asking if anybody has a question verbally. Having them fill out a mud card at the end of class requires them to reflect on what they heard or did and decide if they understand it and phrase a question, right? I usually ask this and several other questions on a Google form so that I can download the results. And that feedback from students is good. You can go back the next class and answer any questions that a lot of students had. I worked with a faculty member at MIT who was changing his curriculum somewhat and very interested in how students felt about it. And we did these mud cards after every class. And he read them. He had a graduate student assistant who, collated the information. He looked over it and made some changes in the way he organized the class, and also then answered some of the prevalent questions at the beginning of the next class. And so I was working in the teaching and learning lab at the time, and I evaluated these changes that he had made in the class. And one of the things that the students told me was that they really felt heard. It really established a bond in terms of their relationship to the faculty, that simple act of asking them what they didn't understand and then making some changes based on that, and then answering their questions during the next class was really a good relationship. So longer activities are things like I mentioned earlier, asking poll questions, then sending students to breakout rooms to discuss, and then bringing them back and re-polling. So this takes more time, but it's good for difficult concepts where peer interaction might be really helpful. Think, pair, share. I think that's a really common method that people have used. So having them think individually, then share their thoughts with a peer. It's kind of the same principle. Again, if you're online, you could put them in random breakout groups, or you could actually have a sharing partner, right, for all classes. So you could set up a situation where, two people are assigned to, be partners. In terms of maybe it would be difficult to assign a permanent breakout room assignment, but you could, if they knew who their permanent sharing partner was, they could privately message them in Zoom, right? So they could have a discussion back and forth through private messages, and you could have that same sharing effect. Group problem solving, of course, in breakout rooms online is good. And then the last thing I want to talk about is something called interactive lecture demonstrations. So this is probably the longest methodology that I'll talk about, and it's received lots of positive results in terms of student learning. So it's useful when you have a concept that's best explained by showing students how something works. So the interactive lecture demonstrations are pretty carefully scripted, right? It creates a time for telling in a traditional lecture format. The activity that's done causes students to confront their prior understanding of this concept, and then they become ready to learn it in a follow-up lecture. So these are typically done in person. I'll describe the 3 steps and then talk about how I might modify this for an online version. So students are first asked to predict the outcome of some demonstration. So for example, if you were teaching about Snell's law, you might ask students to predict what would happen with light or to light as it moves through the boundary between air and water, right? Individually, and then with a partner, students would explain to each other which of a possible set of outcomes would be most likely to occur. So you're getting them to make that prediction, kind of place their bets on what might happen. But then they experience a demonstration. So working in small groups, the students would then conduct an experiment, take a survey or work with data to determine whether their initial beliefs were confirmed, whether they were right or not. And then they're asked to reflect on the outcome. So they think about, why they thought what was going to happen, why did they think that, and what ways the demonstration or the data they were shown would confirm or contradict these things. So after comparing these thoughts with other students, then they actually write down, the conclusion, like what they learned from the process. So if you're teaching this remotely, you can follow the process until you get to the part where, they're doing the demonstration as a group. You could actually have them do a simulation, however, and they could engage in that, in a breakout room. So research shows that students do get a better understanding of course material when traditional lectures are combined with interactive demonstrations. So each step in the demonstration, the predicting, the experiencing, the reflecting, contributes to student learning. And that process, I think, is motivating in that, once I make that prediction, once I say this is going to happen, then I'm interested in what happens. And if I'm wrong, I'm also really more interested in why I was wrong, right? So it's motivational as well. One of the things I will leave you with is a handout that gives you, actually it used to be 100 learning activities, but I think it's been expanded. There is a lot of activities on there that you can take a look through and get some ideas from if you're trying to think about activities to use in your classes. It's a link that will, I think, Julia, if you want to post it now, you can, but otherwise we'll leave it at the end of the session so you can go there. Really helpful. And again, earlier I talked about the fact that we don't necessarily want to just do things off of a list. We really want to think about what we're asking students to do. But this list gives you some ideas that you can then modify thinking about it through the ICAP framework. The ICAP framework, again, gives you kind of an evidence-based way to think about planning your lesson. Okay. So you've done a great job of identifying the intended or planned mode of engagement for examples I've given you. So I've given you descriptions of each of the modes of engagement according to ICAP. I've given you examples of each mode. I've asked you to discriminate if it was or was not a good example of each mode. So the next step is to think about these and how we might use these ideas to enhance our own instruction. So we call this sort of bumping up the mode of engagement, or thinking about ways to deepen engagement to get better learning. So I have a link to a Padlet's account, and I've set up 5 different scenarios on there, and they're activities that you might assign your students to do. And I've given you the mode of engagement that I think it would currently elicit. And what I'd like you to do is think about how you'd bump it up. So how would you deepen students' engagement in that activity? And Julia, if you would post the link to Padlet's, that'd be great. So I think we will take, let's see, it's 7:23. Let's take 10 minutes. I think also the nice thing about Padlet's is that this is a way for students to, work individually or work in groups, and others can view their work. So, if you had group work, instead of the old, put the chart paper on the wall and have them stand beside their chart paper and talk about their product, students can be in the Padlet's site and they can see what other groups are doing. They can comment. They can like it by clicking on the heart button. So it's a nice way to get that engagement or that interaction. So I'm going to share the Padlet screen, and we'll take about 10 minutes. And as I said, go there. I should say that it's anonymous. Your posts are anonymous. You can choose to identify the poster, but I left it anonymous. So please don't be bashful. Go see, try out some ideas. Think about how you might bump up these activities to a deeper mode of engagement. I don't think we actually need 10 minutes to go through this. You guys have done a great job. I see lots of good ideas here. Predicting, creating models. Yeah, so very good solutions to these. One of the things I thought about for the first one, about the engineering report or a paper, it could be any kind of a paper, is to ask them to develop the criteria for grading. Like, what do they think is a good report, right? So first thinking about that and have them develop a rubric, and then, you know, talk about it with them and discuss it. So it would be more of a co-construction. And actually I encountered, I met with somebody not too long ago who said they do develop rubrics with their students, which is really a nice approach, I think, because not only do they really understand how they'll be graded, they actually helped construct it, which gives them a little bit more vested interest in it and a little more ownership of the process. Of course, you would maybe make sure that that included all the things that needed to be included, not, yeah, okay. Okay, I think we'll go back to the other slide now. Were there any here that people wanted to ask questions about? Were there some that you had any questions about or thoughts? I'll go through these again later. One of the beauties, I think, of using Padlet is that, you know, it stays here. I can come back and I can write comments, right? So you can give your learners feedback right here on Padlet, and they can, if they can come back to it. Okay. I do believe I've, hang on. Ah, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay, can you see my screen now? Yes, okay, great. Great. So again, I think you can use the ICAP framework to think about things that maybe that you currently do, or even things that you're planning, and think about, you know, is this as engaged as I can encourage my students to be? You know, there are ways that maybe you could bump it up, so to speak. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about, and then we'll have time for some questions, is barriers to using active learning. As faculty, when we hear the words active learning, we often think about things like efficiency and preparation time. You know, can I cover this much? Can I cover the same material? How much time will it take to do this? One of the projects I worked in showed us that deepening students' understanding with active learning activities actually allowed the faculty member to move faster through the content. So that's something to keep in mind. Students understood the material better the first time through when they spent time actively engaged in it. This was a probability and statistics class where they did a lot of problem solving, and they spent time group solving problems as a group, you know, at a whiteboard with faculty sort of rotating through the room and helping them when they had issues. So it was a good outcome in terms of covering content. Class time, this is a common complaint, but again, the time spent deepening students' knowledge seems to be worth the time that it takes to do those activities. Another worry of faculty is effect on course evaluations. This, however, is not always a problem. So I came across a study of over 400 physics and astronomy professors, and after initiating active learning in their courses, 50% of the course evaluations went up, 30% showed no change, and then 20% did indeed go down. So it was definitely a majority that either stayed the same or went up. And lastly, you know, we think about student resistance, right, to active learning strategies, especially if they've not experienced this before. Student resistance can be significant. they say things like, well, this is more work for me, or can I really learn this way? If they're not used to, actively engaging and talking about what they're learning, they're not so sure that they can actually learn well that way. And then some students argue that it expects too much of them. Engaging actively in the material does take work, takes more cognitive effort. And we know that the outcomes are better, but that's not always something that students readily admit. Sometimes their resistance can take forms of nonverbal resistance. So they just passively don't participate. They sit in the back of the room and don't participate in the clicker questions or the things they're asked to do. Sometimes they exhibit partial compliance. So they do participate, but they're really not enthusiastic about it. And then sometimes students openly resist. They actively complain about the teaching methods, often in front of their classmates, and are really disheartened by it. So I think, one of the things I always think about when I get to this point is, we need to have evidence in our arsenal. We need to be able to talk about why this is good for them. And the very good news is that there's a recent study from Harvard, which I've placed in the reference list so you can see it, showed that students who engaged in active learning felt like they learned less, but they actually learned more, significantly more, than students who listened to a very charismatic lecturer who everybody considered to be excellent. So this was a randomized controlled trial. They put students in a group that, they picked a lecturer again who was widely known to be wonderful. And the other group of students engaged in active learning activities for the same material. They tested them after each class and how they felt about what they learned and what they actually learned. So the students who were engaged in the active learning activities felt like they weren't sure they learned, right? Because it's hard. It's hard to do some of these things and engage actively, but in the end, they learned more. So interesting to keep in mind, I think. This slide is just for entertainment value, maybe. I think the reactions that students have to active learning are sometimes classified the same way that we classify stages of grief related to terminal illness, which I thought was an interesting correlation. So shock, denial, students sometimes say, I don't believe it. We have to do homework in groups. They're not going to lecture on the chapter before the problems are due. These are reactions that, come from students. Eventually you can see as you read down through there, that emotion kind of gives way to some surrender, maybe a little acceptance. Maybe they'll explore it a little bit. And then if they have some success, then they get more confident. And then they think, well, okay, this is the way, this is the way that I can learn. One of the projects that I worked in, we had some faculty integrated some blended learning in a couple different domains and with a couple different levels of students. And the students who provided the most resistance were upper level students, were upper class students who had been sort of very accustomed to learning in particular ways at university. The students who did not protest at all were the incoming freshmen. And we really felt like they thought, well, this is college, right? This is what college is. So I think it sort of speaks to the fact that, if we get them started early and provide good rationale for the pedagogies that we use, it might be a little easier on the student acceptance piece. So there are some recommendations that are helpful when introducing active learning to your students. One is be explicit upfront. So a course in which students are expected to be active can be a bit of a shock for some. So make the case for your choices, for your pedagogy that you use. So I said earlier, be armed with information, read up on the benefits of active learning, and be ready to let your students know that there are well-researched reasons behind the ways that you've designed the course. I have some of those references in my slides today, and I'm sure you've all come across many others that you can use. Treat them also like colleagues, right, whose cooperation you need, and say, we're going to do these things. I'm interested in your feedback. We know that they work, and we're interested in how they work for you. Be open. throughout the semester, get into the habit, again, of justifying the activities that as you introduce them. You know, let them know why particular exercises or pedagogies will be helpful. You know, when we telling them things like, when we reflect on what we hear, we discover what we don't understand or where we need more information. If you're introducing activities where their work would be graded, using rubrics or annotated examples of past work to show them how you'll be assessing their work is really helpful. They're less likely to resist your pedagogy if you cultivate that relationship of openness throughout. And then vary your teaching methods. So some students might resist your attempts to integrate active learning just because you always do the same kind of activity. So vary them slightly. You want your teaching to benefit both the extrovert who loves collaborative exercises and maybe the quiet bookworm type who really excels more at in-class writing assignments. So vary those types of activities so that keep everybody engaged. And lastly, lecture sometimes, right? Don't get the idea that active learning means you can never lecture, right? There are still perfectly good reasons to lecture to your students. Some of the time, a lecture component can help increase the benefits of the learner-centered activities that you use during the rest of the class. So get into the habit of closing every class period with a brief summary or a synthesis of what you think your students have learned in the preceding hour. And then any students who are unsure about these kind of methods appreciate the familiarity of a professor kind of re-emerging for the last 10 minutes to help them, you know, make sense of things. And so I leave you with this parting assignment. And if you're introducing active learning to your students for the first time, or even just new activities, maybe you've done active learning and you're trying to, you know, introduce some new activities, plan what you'll say to your students about that activity, like why it's important to their learning and what it will be doing to help them learn the material. Think about your own students, like what questions will you anticipate? I always had a particular group of students who I knew were going to ask the tough questions. And so I would always see their face and say, okay, this is what I'm going to say to that guy. So think about your students. What kind of questions will they be asking, and be ready for those? And then I have as my last bullet, practice. Like, don't just think that stuff, say it out loud, hear it coming out of your mouth so that you're ready to say it when the time comes. And I will confess to you that many great ideas that Glenda has had went by the wayside when I walked into a classroom and faced the class, and suddenly I thought, oh no, I can't do that today, right? So be ready for that. You know, practice what you're going to say, how you're going to deliver it, and put it out there. So this last slide, and I'm going to zip through this because I'll let you read it when you get the slides. I think these are darling things to think about and say to students if they are resistant to active learning. And these are not mine. These are people that write extensively on active learning in the engineering field, but good things to think about. And as I said, I'll let you see them when you see the slides. Okay, so in summary, we've talked about engagement. We've talked about a lot. Engagement in online courses. We've talked about ICAP for planning instruction. We've talked about a little bit about time needed for some of the activities and converting some of these activities into an online or a digital format. We've talked about the idea of one versus many, making sure that we try to engage all students versus one. Talked about student resistance, and then just a little bit about introducing active learning pedagogy. So I really hope that our time has given you some inspiration and some ideas for designing your classes to increase engagement, both online and in person. In person when or if ever we reach that point. But thank you for your time and kind attention. And I think we have a few minutes left to take some questions if you have some.
Thank you very much, Glenda. This has been a very insightful and engaging conference. And yes, we have some time for questions so that you can expand a little bit more on some of your reflections. In fact, here I have one question from Ana Berrecos. She says that they have been promoting the flipped learning model, and they recommend to use the passive, active, and some of the constructive to the asynchronous work, individual or collaborative, through the virtual platform activities, and also to leave some of the constructive and all the interactive for the synchronous sessions, face-to-face or Zoom sessions using the proper digital tools. Her question is whether you think that this is a good way to focusing the use of the ICAP model in the flipped learning classroom, or what would be your suggestions concerning this?
Yeah, I do think it's a great way to use it. And so if you can get students into the habit of preparing for that class and engaging in the material, then the in-class or the synchronous time is the perfect time for the interactive mode of engagement, definitely. One of the courses that I worked with, and I think, Emilio, you heard this professor talk at the faculty development workshop, Jerry Orloff, right? He
Yes.
came this summer. Yeah, he did a flipped classroom, and then he was the person who spent the time in class having students. They did a few clicker questions and a little bit of discussion, but then a lot of it was solving problems, you know, as a group at the blackboard, where he and his assistant rotated around, and he got a great idea of what they understood, you know, where their difficulties were, and was able to sort of scaffold their learning. So that was a good example of using that interactive mode of engagement during the in-person class time, or during the class time.
Yeah, another question from Ernesto Mauleon. He says that in a typical class of 2 hours, it's very complicated to maintain an active or interactive class the entire time. What would be your recommendation on this for an extensive class of 2 hours?
Yeah, 2 hours is hard. I definitely agree. I would definitely insert some pauses there, let them fix their notes, have a little mental break. I would vary some of those activities, you know, put them in maybe a poll question with a breakout group discussion would be helpful, so that they have a little switching back and forth and some peer interaction time. But I would definitely try to get multiple types of activities in that 2 hours.
We have another question from Ana Berrecos. She says, for the interactive work, the process of collaboration undergone by students must be assessed, not only the final product they present. Would you recommend a rubric to evaluate that process?
Yeah, the collaborative process, especially the collaborative products, are always challenging. I've used a rubric for the product. I have also required presentations along with the product and required everybody in the group to be part of the presentation. So, you know, not just one person who is the best speaker or whatever to give the presentation, but everybody in the group has to do some of that. And then I've had them evaluate each other, right? So, and tell me what proportion of the product they felt each person contributed towards, which is an interesting concept as well. But yeah, it's a difficult thing to assess, I agree.
Thank you very much, Glenda. We still have some more time for some other questions if you want to write them in the chat or in the question and answers room. And meanwhile, Griselda Barra asks whether there is one specific or particular book on active learning that you prefer or that you may recommend us.
If you want a textbook, ooh, I'll have to think about that. There are several out there. I mean, I would recommend reading some of Dr. Chi's writing, you know, because she talks about it more extensively. She's actually a very good, clear writer, so that's helpful always. But there are some other books about active learning, but let me get back to you on that because I don't have any on the top of my head right now. There are many.
Yeah, you can send that to us and we'll of passing it over to our teachers. Maybe one final question. Valeria says, thinking about feedback and its importance, could you mention some suggestions on how to do it in the ICAP model? The feedback question.
Within the ICAP model, I mean, the ICAP is really to help us plan activities, right? So it's good to get us to think about engaging students as we're planning activities. You know, feedback fits into that, of course. We want to give them feedback as they engage in the activities, but I don't know if I can tell you that we would use ICAP for feedback. But a lot of the work that's been done on feedback, you know, talks or speaks to sort of the way we give feedback and the clarity of the feedback and how important that is. Making sure that, you know, we give them specific feedback about, you know, what they need to improve, as opposed to something very general like this paper needs to be better, right? Giving them feedback about, you know, your points need to have more backing or more theoretical components, or, you know, I don't know if your argument needs to be well supported, or, you know, giving them specific things to improve on. I'm not sure if that answers her question or not.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Questions we have. Pilar Echezarreta asks, or ask your advice on how to apply ICAP to Architecture Studio, teaching students about creativity, intuition, handcraft, discussion on different personal projects that are not always concrete formulas, using Zoom. She says that she has been using Concept Board as a way to share personal projects and discussions.
She's been using, I didn't catch what you said. She's been using what?
Concept Board.
Concept Board? I don't know exactly what that is, I think. Is that a software or?
Yeah, it's a tool for stimulating the participation and collaboration of students.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think in architecture, well, first of all, do they need to be drawing as they're collaborating? Is that part of it? Or is it the idea phase where they would be collaborating?
Yeah, she says that it's a platform actually to share drawing concepts.
Nice. Yeah. I think that is probably one of the best examples of an interactive mode of engagement, right? If they can draw collaboratively and then explain to each other, you know, what their goal is for a particular piece of the structure or whatever it is they're designing, I'm not sure, but that really lays the framework or the groundwork for good interactive exchange. Because they would, in the end, would co-construct a product that they had jointly developed, right? And for particular reasons.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your great conference. It's great having you here with us, sharing all this knowledge and your experience on long-distance learning. And I also want to thank Julia for being here with us. Of course, our Vice Chancellor, Silvia Schmelkes, that she has been the whole conference with us here, Lourdes Caudillo, and of course, all the people that has been following this conference in this afternoon.
That's great. One more thing I'll ask of you, if Julia would post the link. I have a mud card for you. I would love to know what's still not clear to you after this session. You know, I use that for formative feedback for me, and then if there are resources that I can send to you, I would definitely do that. So I think, is Julia still here? Or did she, I know she had to go to a meeting.
Yes, posted.
Okay, awesome, Julia. Thank you very much. Yeah. So thank you all for your time and kind attention. I know that this is busy and a challenging time for all of you. So I really appreciate your being here. My very best to you as you continue on to do what you do best, to teach and produce those learners.
Likewise, Glenda, thank you very much. and we'll be very attentive to all the extra resources, materials, and bibliography that you may send us to share with our audience.
Will do. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Glenda.
You're very welcome.
Glenda.
Yeah, thank you. Just one more thing in Spanish. En el chat acabo de poner un link para que todos los participantes evalúen la sesión, si son tan amables de entrar a este link y responder qué les ha parecido la conferencia para evaluar la pertinencia de la misma. Gracias, gracias a todos. Thank you very much, Glenda. Very interesting, very useful. I'm grateful. Thanks.
You're very, very welcome.
Thank you. Gracias a todos y a todas. Nos vemos muy pronto. Seguiremos con este ciclo de conferencias la siguiente semana, a la misma hora y el mismo día.
Será el miércoles.
En esta ocasión va a ser el miércoles.
Sí, miércoles 11 sobre evaluación formativa, evaluación de aprendizajes y evaluación formativa a distancia, con Graciela Loureiro de la Universidad Católica de Uruguay. Están todos cordialmente invitados.
Muy bien, nos vemos pronto. See you all very soon again. Thank you. Thank you, Glenda. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sí, gracias, Tere. Gracias por tu apoyo, Absolutamente. Absolutamente. Qué bueno que compraste uno. Gracias. Muchísimo gusto. Gracias. Hasta luego. Gracias.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego. Pues muchas gracias, Silvia, por acompañarnos también. Tienes tu micrófono apagado.
Gracias, Silvia. Tu micrófono está apagado, Silvia. Tu micrófono está apagado, Silvia.
Sí, es que estoy en la encuesta y no podía regresar a apagar mi micrófono, perdón. Sí, aprenderlo. Sí, excelente. Muchísimas gracias. Gracias, Emilio. Estuvo excelente la conferencia. Creo que fue de gran utilidad. Sí.
Gracias a ti.
A esta persona. Sí. Bueno, hasta
muy
mañana.
bueno.
Gracias, que descansen.
Hasta luego.
Gracias, Marco.
Buenas noches. Gracias,
Oye, Marco, ¿puedes grabar el chat, por favor?
Sí.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, pues nos podemos retirar entonces.
Muy bien.
Gracias, que descansen,
Igualmente.
Gracias, Emilio. Muy buen trabajo.
Igualmente. Hasta